Chapter 3 Historical Perspectives of Education. In the past half century, many changes have occurred in the United States. The phenomenal change and growth in both the size and complexity of U.S. educational establishments, the tremendous new demand and expectations being placed on our schools and teachers by the current information age, to provide equal education opportunities for all students, and an understanding that the history of education is a very practical value in helping contemporary educators improve education. The total number of public school students in the United States has doubled during this time. Part of this was contributed to overpopulation growth, but a good part was due to the greater percentage of people actually going to school. People were staying in school much longer too, with the higher enrollments and higher education. The need for new classrooms and buildings to house these students also increased. This need for new schools was generally concentrated in cities and suburbs. In fact, because of increased busing, school district consolidation, and shifting in populations, some smaller schools were no longer needed. However, in larger cities, there was a drastic shortage of classrooms. Many schools had to resort to temporary mobile classrooms. Some schools went to larger class sizes, splitting schedules that started some classes very early in the day and others very late, and classes held in a variety of makeshift areas such as a gym, hallway, and storage closets. Some schools rented additional spaces in nearby buildings. With additional population growth, additional teachers were needed. At the time where colleges could not simply produce enough teachers, states lower their certification requirements, and even to the point where no requirement was even required at all for a teacher to teach. With the barrage of new students to be taught, schools needed more of everything: buildings, buses, books, instructional materials, and teachers, administration, and assistants. With this, they needed additional funding from states and federal government. In the last 75 years, the number of school districts was reduced from 117,000 in the 1940s to roughly 14,000 today. Over the same period of time, there was a decline in one-teacher schools. With growing school districts and school consolidations from rural to urban areas, both the number of students and the percentage of students who are bused to schools have increased considerably during the past 75 years, along with the total cost and per pupil cost of busing. General busing of students necessitated by schools that were consolidated. Integration efforts have often involved busing students away from their neighborhoods to schools in different neighborhoods. 60% of all students are bused to school by about 450,000 school buses per day. Over the past 75 years, school budgets have grown astronomically. In 1940, $2 billion. 1950, $5 billion, $15 billion in 1960, $40 billion in 1970, $97 billion in 1980, and $208 billion in 1990. The percentage of gross domestic product spent on education has risen from 3.5% in 1940 to 7% in 1980. As society has become more complex and as enrollments still continue to increase and schools have grown larger and larger and more diverse, curriculum and programs have been developed in U.S. schools. In 1942, the Progressive Education Association did an 8-year study at 30 different high schools. The study showed that progressive schools achieved as well as students at traditional schools. This report helped create a climate that was more hospitable to experimentation with school curriculum and teaching methodologies. After the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the National Defense Education Act, NDEA, provided a mass infusion of federal dollars to improve schools in science, math, engineering, and foreign language programs. Eventually, curricula such as SMSG, Mathematics, VSCS, Biology, and PSCS, Physics grew out of these programs. Guidance was later founded by the NDA also. In the last 75 years, curriculum was narrow and designed primarily for students that were bound to go to college. Going fast forward to today, curriculum is broader and designed for students of all abilities. Historically, in the past, public schools did not provide special education programs for children with disability. They rather were just simply accommodated and put in the regular classroom. That all changed with the Educations for All Handicapped Children's Act. Did schools begin to develop well-designed programs for students with disabilities? New special education programs required teachers who had trained to work with students with visual and hearing impairments, students with behavior disorders, and students with a range of other exceptionalities. Congress has passed several federal laws that provided funds for specific educational programs, and has passed many laws and regulations pertaining to schools. Presidents have created programs and regulations affecting schools, and federal courts have handed down decisions that have granted ramifications for schools that do not follow policy. One such program was the Vocational Education for National Defense Act, that was a crash program to prepare workers in needed industrial to produce goods for national defense. The program operated through state education agencies and trained more than 7 million workers. In 1941, the Lanham Act provided funds for buildings, maintaining and operating community facilities in areas where local communities had unusual burdens because of defense and war initiatives. In 1944, the GI Bill helped provide education for veterans of World War II. Later, similar bills assisted veterans in Korea, Vietnam, and other conflicts. These federal acts afforded education to more than 10 million veterans at the cost of almost $20 billion. As these acts were initiated, like the GI Bill, the initial cost of these acts amounted to a wonderful national investment because the government was repaid many times over by increased taxes eventually paid by veterans who received these financial aids and later were employed. The National Science Foundation was established in 1950 and emphasized the need for continuous support of basic scientific research. This program was created to promote the progress of science, to advance national health, prosperity, and welfare, to secure the national defense, and for other purposes. With cooperative research programs of 1954, the U.S. Commission of Education entered contracts with universities, colleges, and state agencies to carry on educational research. One such program, operating at Dakota State University in South Dakota, is that DSU is working with the national government with cybersecurity. Different federal aid that was enacted after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik was NDAA, the Vocational Education Act of 1963, Manpower Development and Training Act of 62, Elementary and Secondary Education of 65, International Education of 66, are examples of increased federal participation in education affairs and federal dollars infused into our schools and colleges and universities. With the increased population of schools in the past half-century, equal education opportunities for all children, regardless of race, creed, religion, or gender, has still been a struggle. Groups that have brought this to our attention are such as the African American activist movement, women's rights movement, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, and Asian Americans. Two of the federal government's most recent major efforts to improve education and to help children learn are sweeping laws commonly referred to as No Child Left Behind and ESSA, Every Student Succeed. Examples of criticisms that are: 1. Insufficient fundings have not been made available to effectively implement the law. 2. The mandate tested required by law is not sufficiently valid and reliable and are too time-consuming. And 3. These laws and required testing do not take into account the extremely varied abilities of students. In the 19th and 20th century, teacher training programs were developed, and by the mid-20th century, each state had established teacher certification requirements. In addition to teacher education, the professionalism movement has touched just about all facets of education: curriculum, teaching methods, training of school service personnel, could be administrators or counselors, librarians, and anybody else that works in the school, in-service teacher trainings, teacher organizations, and even school building construction. In early colonial America, schools were private and religion was the main purpose of the education at the time. Children were taught to read primarily so they could read the Bible, and most early colleges were private and existed primarily to train ministers. When public school systems were developed and crafted over time, the religious nature of education gradually diminished to a point where relatively few U.S. children attended religious schools. Over the last 25 to 50 years, enrollment at non-Catholic religious schools has grown, whereas Catholic school enrollment has declined. Private and parochial schools struggle to raise funds because they need to charge students a tuition fee, rely on private contributions, and conduct various fundraisers and activities to keep their doors open. Parents do not want their students to go to public school, private schools, or parochial schools. Homeschooling is one way of educating their students. It varies, but often it stems from a concern that children in the public school may be exposed to problems such as drugs, alcohol, and smoking, and gangs. Other parents have religious motivation, want their children to be taught in a particular religious content, and still others who may have had a bad experience in public school simply feel that they can do a better job teaching their children at home. Shortly after the United States became a nation, new immigrants needed to learn English, caused schools, churches, and various groups to offer English language instructions. Factories found a need to offer jobs and safety training. Churches taught about religious instruction. A Methodist Sunday school started in 1874 in New York, offered courses in correspondence, lecture, and music. In 1964, the Economic Opportunity Act provided adults basic education funding to help adults learn to read and write.